In the middle of August, with no ice and no refrigerator, a frontier family sat down to a dinner of ham that was still perfectly good. The hog it came from had been dead since the previous December. They were eating pork that was more than half a year old in the worst heat of the year, and not one of them got sick. So how does a family with no electricity and no cold storage keep meat edible straight through a summer that would rot a fresh cut in a single afternoon? The answer is the thing that makes this story so strange. It doesn't begin in the summer at all. It begins on a freezing morning the previous winter, on a farm where the ground was hard and the cold bit at your hands, because the secret to surviving summer was a decision. These families made months before the heat ever arrived. They never tried to keep fresh meat fresh through July. They knew that was a losing fight. Instead, they turned the meat into something the summer couldn't touch. To understand why, you have to picture what summer heat actually did to meat out here. A hog butchered on a hot July afternoon was a problem by sundown. Warmth is everything bacteria need to multiply, and in a frontier kitchen, there was no way to slow them down. Flies found the meat within minutes and laid their eggs in it. By the next morning, a fresh cut left out in that heat was turning gray, going slick, and starting to smell. Within a day or two, it was dangerous to eat. So the families who lived through these summers learned a hard lesson early. Fresh meat in hot weather was a race they would always lose. And the smart move was to never enter that race at all. It also helps to know why the animal at the center of this was almost always a pig. Pigs were cheap to raise, they ate nearly anything a farm threw at them, and they put on a thick layer of fat that took beautifully to salt and smoke. A single good hog could weigh 200 pounds or more and feed a family for a year if it was handled right. Beef and wild game could be preserved too, but pork was the workhorse of frontier preservation, and almost every part of the animal could be saved. That's why the whole system started with the calendar rather than the kitchen. On these farms, the big hog slaughter waited for the first reliable cold of late autumn, usually after Thanksgiving, when the weather had turned cold enough to be safe, but had not yet locked into a hard freeze around the clock. The cold was the first preservative, and it bought them the one thing they needed most, which was time. A fresh ham had to be packed into its cure within about a day of the kill, with the meat chilled down to around 40 degrees, because if the inside of that ham stayed warm, it would spoil before the salt could ever reach the center. This is the detail most people miss when they imagine frontier life. The date on the calendar mattered more than almost anything else on the farm. Once the hog was down and chilled, the real work began, and it revolved around one ingredient that was worth its weight in money out on the frontier, and that ingredient was salt. The family carried the fresh hams and shoulders and sides of bacon to a cool work table, often inside a smokehouse or a cold back room, and then they buried that meat in coarse salt. This was no light seasoning. They packed it on, rubbing it deep into every surface and pressing it hard against the bone, then covered the whole cut so almost no meat was left showing. The salt did something quiet and relentless. It pulled the water straight out of the meat, drawing moisture across every cell, and bacteria simply cannot grow in something that dry and salty. Many families mixed in a little saltpeter, which kept the meat a healthy red color and added another layer of protection, and some worked in brown sugar or molasses to soften the flavor. The work did not end once the meat was buried either. Careful families went back and overhauled the cure partway through, lifting the hams out, draining off the liquid the salt had pulled free, and repacking everything in fresh, dry salt so the meat kept drawing down instead of sitting in its own brine. It was a messy, cold, hands-on chore done in the dead of winter, and skipping it was how a ham could quietly go bad in the middle while still looking perfectly fine on the outside. Then came the part that tested everyone's patience, because curing meat with salt is slow by its very nature. The rule old hands went by was about 7 days in the salt for every inch of thickness, so a thick country ham could sit packed in salt for the better part of a month, sometimes 5 or 6 weeks for the biggest legs. All that time, the meat had to stay cold but never frozen, somewhere in the range of a modern refrigerator, and this is where the cool buildings on the farm earned their keep. A cellar, a north-facing room, or a stone spring house with creek water running through it held a steady temperature in the mid-50s, and that was perfect for holding the meat while the salt did its work. And this is the point where most people assume the job was finished, when really the salt had only made the meat safe. The step that came next is what made it last for months, and it is the part that gave this food its name. Inside the smokehouse, the meat began its second transformation. After the long salt cure, the family brushed and washed the salt off the hams, sometimes scrubbing them and letting them dry until a slightly tacky skin formed on the surface, which helped the smoke cling. Then they hung the hams high from the rafters of a small, tight log or stone building and lit a slow, smoldering fire underneath, usually of hickory or another hardwood. The goal was never a hot, roaring blaze. It was a cool, steady stream of smoke that could drift up and around the meat for days at a time, and the family tended that fire carefully to keep it smoking rather than burning. The smoke did 3 jobs at once. It dried the outside of the meat into a tough protective layer, it coated the surface in natural compounds from the wood that killed bacteria and kept insects away, and it gave the ham the deep, smoky flavor that people still chase today. When the smoking was finished, the ham looked and smelled completely different from the pale, fresh leg the family had started with. It was firm, dark, and dry on the outside, sealed against the world. But the meat still had a long way to go, because the final stage was patience itself. The families wrapped these hams in cloth or paper, slid them into cotton sacks to guard against flies, and hung them from the rafters of the smokehouse or a cool loft to age. There the hams would hang for months, slowly drying and deepening in flavor, growing more concentrated with every passing week. A properly cured and smoked country ham handled this way could keep for a full year, hanging in the open air with no ice and no cold of any kind. By the time July arrived and the fields were baking, those hams were at their finest, and a family could cut into one whenever they needed it. The flies were a relentless enemy during those warm months of aging. A particular pest that curers came to dread laid its eggs in any exposed meat, and the tiny maggots could ruin a ham from the inside while it hung there looking fine. So families fought back with everything they had. They coated the cut face and any soft spots with a thick dusting of black pepper, which the insects would not crawl across, wrapped the whole ham in paper and then a tight cloth sack, and hung it high where the air moved freely. A ham that made it through its first summer of aging untouched was a small victory earned all over again every year, and there was a simple way to know whether all that effort had paid off. Because a cured ham could look flawless on the outside and still be spoiling deep down near the bone, where the salt reached last, an experienced hand would push a thin skewer or a clean sliver of bone straight into the joint, pull it out, and smell it. A clean, smoky aroma meant the ham was good all the way through. A sour or rotten smell meant the center had turned, and the whole leg was lost. That one quick smell told them everything the outside never could. All of this depended on one thing the family could not make for themselves, and that was the salt. Out on the frontier, salt was genuinely valuable, hauled in over long distances and guarded like money, because without enough of it, the entire meat supply for the year could be lost. A household that ran short on salt in the autumn was a household gambling with hunger in the spring. Now, a whole smoked ham was a special thing, the prize cut a family might save for company or a holiday. The meat that actually carried most frontier households through the long months was humbler, and it lived in a barrel. They called it salt pork. Families cut the fattier parts of the hog into chunks, packed them tight into a wooden barrel in thick layers of salt, and then covered everything in a heavy brine strong enough to float an egg. Sealed under that brine and kept in a cool cellar, salt pork could last almost indefinitely, and a cook would simply reach in, pull out a piece, soak some of the salt out of it, and drop it into a pot of beans or greens. This was the daily backbone of frontier eating, the reliable protein that showed up on the table again and again, long after butchering season was a distant memory. If you are enjoying this walk through how the frontier actually fed itself, take a second to subscribe. Every week, I break down another lost skill that kept these families alive. All of that effort points back to one single image, a family eating good ham in the dead heat of August. And there's a popular picture of how they pulled it off that gets the story almost completely backwards. When people imagine pioneers keeping food through the summer, they almost always picture the spring house. That little stone hut built over a creek with cold water running through a channel in the floor, holding the air inside at a steady mid-50s all year long. The spring house was real, and it was genuinely useful. It kept the milk sweet, chilled the butter and the cream, held eggs and fruit, and stored the crocks of already salted pork down in the cold water. But the storybook version leaves out the most important detail. A spring house could never have kept a fresh cut of meat safe through July. The mid-50s is cool enough to slow spoilage by a few days, the same way a modern refrigerator only buys you a week or so, and it comes nowhere near stopping it across months of heat. The spring house cooled the things that were already preserved. The salt and the smoke were what made the meat survivable in the first place. There's a reason this whole craft is still talked about and still practiced today. This is the same skill that gave the American South its famous aged country hams, the salt-cured, hickory-smoked, long-hung legs that small producers in places like Virginia, Kentucky, and the hills of Appalachia still make in much the same way their great-grandparents did. And out on the old farms, nothing on that hog went to waste. The hams and shoulders became smoked centerpieces, the belly and sides became bacon and salt pork, the trimmings and odd cuts went into sausage and were smoked or packed down, and even the fat was rendered into lard for cooking while the bones were boiled for broth. A single animal handled with skill turned into a year of meals across a dozen different forms, and almost none of it depended on cold once the work was done. So picture that family again, sitting down to ham in the middle of August. That meal was built backwards from the heat, starting on a cold morning the previous December when the hog was killed in weather cold enough to keep it safe. It passed through weeks, buried in hard-won salt that drew out every drop of moisture bacteria needed to live. It hung for days in the cool, steady smoke of a hickory fire that sealed and protected it, and then it waited month after patient month in a cloth sack up in the rafters, growing richer the whole time. By the time the hottest day of the year arrived, that ham had already won. The family wasn't standing in the kitchen fighting the summer. They had simply stepped around it, planning so far ahead that the heat never had anything fresh left to spoil. Think about the discipline that took on a farm with 100 other chores screaming for attention all at once. It's a way of living that rewarded people who could look months down the road and act on it in the cold of winter, knowing the payoff wouldn't arrive until the warmth of summer. That single skill repeated every year is a big part of how families fed themselves on the edge of the map long before the first refrigerator ever hummed to life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. If you would like to continue watching more of my videos on frontier skills, you can click the video on the screen now.